Hi, I'm Neil Hermes and welcome to my weekly bird wrap where I've got three really great stories this week about three really interesting birds. The Mallee Whipbird, the Lyrebird and the koel. Hi, I'm Neil Hermes and welcome to my weekly bird wrap. This week I'd like to bring you a story about the koel. Now, the koel is a bird that has caused all sorts of issues in southern Australia in the last couple of decades, I suppose, because of its loud and haunting call that it does all through the night. Of course, koels are a type of cuckoo, and the males have this haunting call that they do to try and attract the females and to set out their territories. The problem with koels is they call all night as well, and the calls are fairly haunting and many people don't like them. Now, this is fine if you're used to koels and you've had them around all your life, but koels have been expanding and they've been coming further and further south each year with each migration. And only in the last decade or two, they've arrived in Canberra, and they're now settling in places where people have never heard koels before. And suddenly they've got this new bird that's calling all night. This year, because of all the wet weather we've had, the koels have been migrating down out of New Guinea later than normal. So people have had a bit of a respite from the call, and the calling has started a couple of weeks later than it normally would have. But this has made a bit of news because people feel that that's a good thing if the koels aren't calling around their houses. I actually love the sound of the koels. They are haunting, they are interesting, sort of strange sound, but for me, they are the sound of summer. They're the sound of the bird song and birds breeding. I love the sound of koels, but I understand how some people wouldn't like them, and I understand why this year, with the delayed arrival of koels, people have been a bit relieved and had a bit more of a sleep in on some evenings. My second story this week is about the Mallee Whipbird. Now, whipbirds come in a number of species, and there's a group of birds called the Western Whipbird, which includes the Mallee Whipbird, and they occur in WA and in South Australia and in Victoria. The form that's found in Victoria had been assumed to be extinct for about the last 80 years. But fantastically, a population has been rediscovered in the Mallee in Western Victoria, variously called the Western Whipbird or the Mallee Whipbird or the white-breasted Whipbird. But it does go to show that with some of these very rare birds, unless we look in some very, very remote locations, we might be overlooking them. And fortunately, if we do research, we may well find that some of these species, whilst we think they may have gone extinct, are actually still around. And that's the good story about this particular species of whipbird in Western Victoria. We now know that there's some left. We don't know how many yet, but the good news is that we now know we have some, and potentially we'll be able to protect that bird into the future. So the white-breasted whipbird, or Western Whipbird, or Mallee Whipbird, whichever name you want to use for it, rediscovered in Victoria only in the last month or so. So that's a great story of rediscovery from a bird in Victoria. My last story this week is a really amusing story, and you really have to listen to the clip that's attached to this story. You really do have to be concerned for people who manage big zoos. Taronga Zoo has all of these animals in the middle of a big city, and the worst thing that can possibly happen happened to them just recently. A number of lions escaped from their enclosure in the zoo. And of course, this is a very serious matter for the zoo to manage, and they had to evacuate the zoo, and it was an emergency, it was a crisis. But the crisis didn't go unobserved by one of the birds that lived in an aviary in the zoo, the lyrebird. Now, many of you would know that lyrebirds love to mimic sounds. Well, the thing that the lyrebird then started to do was to mimic the evacuation bells at the zoo. So when it heard the bells, it learnt the evacuation whoop, whoop, whoop sound, and it started doing that sound at will, which meant that people then didn't know whether or not, in fact, it was an emergency or not, or whether it was the birds doing the call or not. It's an amusing side story to what is a very serious matter, of course, because the lions being at large was not a good thing for the zoo, but a great story about the lyrebirds and how they were able to mimic the sound of the evacuation orders. And listen to the clip attached to this story. It's a great sound, and the lyrebirds are fantastic the way they can mimic. And of course, lyrebirds mimic all sorts of sounds: chainsaws, alarms, all sorts of mechanical sounds, musical sounds, as well as other birds. They're an amazing mimic, and they incorporate other sounds into their display calls, all about trying to attract the males, all about trying to attract the female to their particular display mound. So a great story out of Taronga Zoo and their lyrebird this week. So that's all I have time for this week. I hope you enjoyed those stories. Check out the attachments to the various stories attached to the YouTube channel. Have a look at my Facebook page. Have a look at my website page. If you want to go on a safari or a bird tour, check out my site at neilhermes.com.au. Thanks for listening. Cheers.